Prime Minister, 6 months ago you came here, you impressed everybody with your reform agenda, even me. I said if you achieved your goals, I would support you. Economic reform was the cry. And within a couple of weeks, the Commission had proposed to scrap 68 new laws. I thought, crikey, perhaps Blair's going to do it. Perhaps he really is going to reform and change. But no, under your presidency, there have been 3,350 new legislative acts. Total failure on economic reform. On the CAP, you said you'd work to achieve a consensus for reform. Well, in a way you have, I suppose, because you've got 24 countries against you. No CAP reform until 2014. On the budget, you said there'd be no surrender of the UK rebate. Well, it seems to me that you've given away £7 billion of British taxpayers' money for nothing in return. Your only achievement is to open talks with Turkey, which is opposed by the vast majority of people in Europe and will lead to an even higher bill. Why should British taxpayers pay for new sewers in Budapest, for a new underground system in Warsaw, when our own public services are crumbling in London? Why should we pay a penny piece into an organisation whose accounts have not been signed off by the auditors for the last 11 years in a row? This budget deal is game, set and match to President Chirac. No cheese-eating surrender monkey he. Unlike you, he stands up for the French national interest, not some bizarre notion of Europe, and he has outclassed and outplayed you at every turn. Your only real achievement is that Britain is now isolated, alienated. We are completely alone within the European Union, which is why it's been said before. Hang on a second. Everybody else gets an extra minute, Mr. President. I'm asking for 10 seconds. Thank you. Which is why, Prime Minister, I urge you. It's often been said that you wanted to be the permanent President of Europe. Please stay on for a further 6 months, 6 more months of the British presidency, and they'll kick us out. Thank you.
There are, in my experience in politics, there are 3 groups of people. There's, first of all, the reactionaries. Let me just tell you, sir, and your colleagues, you sit with our country's flag, you do not represent our country's interests. This is the year 2005. This is the year 2005, not 1945. We're not fighting each other anymore. These are our partners, they're our colleagues, and our future lies in Europe. And when you and your colleagues say, what do we get in return for what we contribute to enlargement? I tell you what we get. We get a Europe that is unified after years of dictatorship in the East. We get economic development in countries who we have championed. We get a future reform that allows us, once and for all, to put an end to discussion about rebates, common agricultural policy, and get a proper reform budget for Europe. That's what we get if we have the vision to seize that opportunity.
So, it's 2017, Mr. Blair, and you've written in the Sunday Times that open-door immigration leads to people's wages becoming lower, leads to people struggling to get access to public services. Oh, and also, Mr. Blair, apparently it leads to problems of integration in Britain's towns and cities. And you've done all of this by saying that no longer are the policies I had as Prime Minister appropriate? No apology, no admission of how wrong you were, no concept of what you've done to towns and cities all over this country, not just by opening up the doors to 8 and then 10 former communist countries, but by deliberately encouraging mass immigration from the non-EU world as well. Remember, your advisor said you wanted to rub the noses of the right in diversity. Well, you did a jolly good job, and you alienated millions and millions of people. And for you now to come out and in this hypocritical way talk about us controlling immigration, frankly, I think the whole thing is completely beyond the pale.
I think we've had 30 months of negotiation. There is no real consensus as to what form of Brexit people want. And the deal that the Prime Minister's finally concluded with Europe is a deal that no one really wants. So I think the logical thing is to go back to the people and say, you're going to have to give us direction, because Parliament can't agree on what form of Brexit. And it's clear that as a result of this negotiation, our knowledge of what Brexit really means has been vastly enlarged. I think the odd thing with the decision of this magnitude is not, once you go through the process of negotiation, to go back at the end and have a final think about it.
I think it's a pretty loathsome performance, frankly. I mean, he's showing people why he is now one of the most disliked living figures in British politics. He wants to reverse the result of a democratic referendum. He's making it clear that anything must be done to stop us leaving the EU. He suggests that public opinion has shifted. Well, actually, there are more people in favour of Brexit now than there were at the time of the referendum. But the real irony here is, of all the people to argue that we could get a reform deal with the European Union, Tony Blair is probably the worst placed person to do so, because he, as Prime Minister, was President of the EU for 6 months back in 2005. He promised reform of the Common Agricultural Policy. He got none, and yet gave away £7 billion of our rebate. So I don't think he's a trusted figure on this, or frankly, anything else. My main interaction with him was in the last half of 2005, when he was, for 6 months, the President of the European Council, the rotating 6-month presidency. And I think my experience with him during that time said everything. He was, at all times, utterly charming. He displayed a very good sense of humour, of that was no doubt, and at times a self-deprecating sense of humour. He would stand up, and I'd see him in Brussels, but equally in the House of Commons. He'd stand up and tell a joke against himself if things hadn't gone very well, and the public rather liked that, and he was good at that and clever at that. But so he arrived in Brussels, and he was deeply unpopular because of the Iraq war. He walked into a hostile European Parliament. He gave a 35-40-minute speech without any notes. It finished with a huge standing ovation. He was a star. He was a brilliant performer. I think actually, in political terms, the best that I've ever seen. He then launched upon this project of saying, in his 6 months, he was going to reform the European Union, and in particular, the Common Agricultural Policy. This is what he was going to do. And at the end of that 6 months, and it was the week of Christmas, and it was the very last meeting of the governments, and they were up all night, literally up all night. And Blair walked in to a press briefing with MEPs, and I could see he basically hadn't been to bed at all. He looked haggard. The Foreign Office looked embarrassed. Mind you, throughout their history, they often look embarrassed because they get almost everything wrong. And he gave this press conference, having just given away £7 billion of the British rebate in return for no reform of the agricultural policy at all, but the French promising they might have a look at it in a few years' time. And I said to him in my little intervention, I said, look, unlike you, President Chirac actually stands up for his national interest. I said, and he's outclassed you and outplayed you at every twist and turn. And in response, he went absolutely puce. And he pointed his finger at me and he shouted, this isn't 1945. We're not at war with these people anymore. They're our friends. And I think I'm the only person he's ever actually shouted at.